It was November 2nd, 2003. The first snowfall of the season had drifted down overnight, leaving a soft white blanket over the pines surrounding the Harlan family's cabin in northern Michigan. The cabin sat alone on 80 acres, miles from the nearest town, tucked near the edge of a dense woodland that Robert Harlan had known since his youth. At 68, Robert was still active, sharp-minded, military-trained, and fiercely independent. That morning, he'd been up before sunrise, quietly splitting logs out back while his daughter, son-in-law, and 2 young grandchildren slept inside. They'd driven up for a long weekend to mark the start of hunting season and to spend time with the man the grandkids called Pop. Just before 9 a.m., Robert stepped inside to warm his hands. He poured himself a mug of coffee, leaned against the stove, and made a small comment about needing more firewood before the next snow hit. According to his daughter, he wasn't in a rush. No coat, just a flannel overshirt. He said he'd be back in 10 minutes. Then, he walked out the front door with his old canvas gloves and an axe over his shoulder. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. It wasn't immediately alarming. He was known to linger, sometimes taking long loops through the trees, following trails only he knew. But by noon, concern was creeping in. His daughter, Ellen, called out from the porch. No answer. She walked to the woodpile. It was still untouched. She searched the perimeter near the shed. Nothing. By 1:30 p.m., her husband, Tom, grabbed a flashlight and began retracing what they thought might be his path. He returned 45 minutes later, pale and shaken, saying there were no prints in the fresh snow past a certain point, only a single set leading in, none coming out. By sunset, panic had fully set in. Cell service was spotty at the cabin, but they managed to call 911 by driving 3 miles to a turnout. Within the hour, 2 local deputies arrived. Search and rescue was activated. A formal missing person report was filed. What began as confusion quickly slid into something colder. Something is wrong. By dawn the next morning, dozens of searchers were combing the woods, state police, volunteers, locals on ATVs. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the treetops. Dogs were brought in. They followed Robert's trail for roughly 300 yards, then stopped dead near a cluster of rocks. No scent beyond that point, no blood, no broken branches, no dropped gloves or axe. It was as if he'd vanished mid-step. The terrain was rugged but familiar to Robert. He'd hiked it for decades. He'd trained others in wilderness survival. He knew how to build a shelter, start a fire, and mark his trail. He wasn't the type to panic. And yet, there was nothing. No sign of disorientation, injury, or wildlife activity. The snow had stayed light, undisturbed, save for the occasional deer track or fox trail. The search team commander later said, "We had more luck finding people lost 3 days in than we had looking for Robert on day 1. By day 3, temperatures dropped sharply. The family was advised to prepare for the worst. On day 4, the search perimeter widened to include nearby creeks, logging trails, and a deep gully known as the Basin, though no one was confident he'd gone that far. Drones weren't common then, and the forest canopy limited visibility from the air. Still, they tried. But every theory collapsed under the same weight. There was simply no physical trail to follow, no clue to chase. On day 6, the official search was suspended. The family was told that after 72 hours in those temperatures, the likelihood of survival was near zero, even for someone with Robert's experience. Ellen refused to leave the cabin. She stayed an extra week, walking the same loops every morning, calling his name until her voice broke. Her children, 6 and 8 at the time, asked why Grandpa hadn't come back. She told them he must have gotten lost. But that wasn't what she believed. Back in town, people speculated. A bear, maybe, but there was no sign of a struggle. A sinkhole? No open terrain large enough nearby. One neighbor whispered about hunters getting lost in the basin years ago, never found. Another blamed the terrain itself, saying it had a way of rearranging itself when it wanted to keep you. But most people settled into a quiet disbelief. 1 minute he was there. Then he wasn't. For the next month, family members kept returning in small groups, searching alone or with dogs, following gut feelings and half-remembered paths. No one found a thing, not even his axe. In the spring thaw, state police returned to search again with cadaver dogs. Still nothing. Eventually, the Harlans went home. The cabin stood empty for long stretches, a reminder of something they didn't understand. Robert Harland was declared legally dead in 2011. But within the family, it never felt settled. It didn't feel like death. It felt like disappearance, not random, not explainable, not natural. And for 20 years, it stayed that way. Until someone went back. Until someone found the one thing that was never supposed to be found. The dogs picked up his scent fast. On the first day of the organized search, they were brought in by a team out of Marquette, well-trained, proven, reliable. They started from the woodpile, then moved east toward the stand of birch trees where Robert was known to cut kindling. The dogs moved quickly at first, tails high, focused, steady. For the first few hundred yards, everything made sense. There were faint boot prints in the snow, spaced evenly apart, showing no signs of distress or change in pace. It looked like Robert had taken the same trail he always did, a path so familiar he likely could have walked it blindfolded. Then, the trail climbed slightly toward a small ridge of moss-covered stone, no more than 4 feet high, covered in pine, needles and leaf litter. It wasn't a dramatic feature, just a natural rise in the landscape. But something changed there. One of the dogs, a bloodhound named Ruby, froze. The other circled twice, then sat down. The handlers looked at each other, then signaled to the search team. They tried again. Reset from a different angle. Same result. The dogs would approach the ridge, sniff, and stop. No pulling, no barking, no forward movement. The scent trail ended there. Just stopped, like someone had lifted Robert off the ground and carried him away. But there were no additional tracks, no drag marks, no signs of struggle. Thermal imaging was deployed that afternoon. At first, hope flickered. Maybe he was unconscious, curled under a log, generating just enough heat to register. But the scan came back cold. Nothing. Not in the trees, not in the brush, not in the gully beyond the ridge. No heat signature, no disturbed ground, just forest. The ridge itself was unremarkable until you stood on top of it. From there, the land sloped downward into a densely wooded basin about a quarter-mile wide. Thick spruce, uneven footing. A shallow watercourse cut through the far end, nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. Locals had a name for it, the Basin. Not officially marked on any maps, but well known to hunters, hikers, and rescue teams. They described it as strange, not haunted, not cursed, just off. The sound didn't carry right. Shouting echoed strangely. Footsteps didn't always feel like they matched the ground. Radios cut out without warning, and people had gotten lost there before, though never permanently, until now. The search shifted focus. Teams rappelled into the deeper parts of the basin, combing the undergrowth. Cadaver dogs were brought in again. Grid patterns were mapped out and re-walked. Every hollow log, rock pile, and low shrub was overturned. Still nothing. The most frustrating detail was the lack of anything. No discarded gloves, no snapped branches, not even a broken twig or piece of cloth. It was as if Robert had walked to the ridge, stood for a moment, and then ceased to exist. Theories began to splinter. Some believed he may have fallen into a crevice or small pit obscured by brush, but the geology didn't support that. Others thought perhaps a bear or cougar had taken him, but there was no sign of blood, fur, or drag marks. Predators leave evidence. And Robert was no stranger to wilderness danger. He carried a small emergency kit, a whistle, even a flare. He knew how to mark his path, but no markers were found. No emergency gear was used. After 10 days, frustration gave way to resignation. Interviews were conducted again. His daughter insisted he wasn't depressed. The son-in-law confirmed Robert had no debts, no major health issues, no recent conflicts. There was no evidence he'd walked away from his life. He'd left his wallet, keys, and medications at the cabin. His truck was still parked by the shed. There was nothing to suggest intent, but there was also nothing to suggest an accident. By day 12, most of the volunteers had gone home. The official search team began scaling back. The weather worsened, snow deepened, the forest became more dangerous to navigate, and every new pass yielded the same result: no trace, no clue, no closure. On day 14, the sheriff gathered the remaining team members and held a quiet briefing inside the cabin. He told the family the search was being suspended, not ended, just paused until snowmelt or new evidence gave reason to resume. Ellen didn't speak. She stared out the window toward the ridge, eyes unfocused. Her kids sat on the couch, confused but quiet. Tom asked one last time if the dogs could be run again. The handler said no, they already had. The scent was gone. It had never extended past the ridge. That night the cabin was silent. No one slept. The basin remained dark. And Robert Harland remained missing. His name would later be added to a state database, marked with a red asterisk for unresolved wilderness disappearance. But inside the family, something else had started. An unease not rooted in grief, but in the sense that whatever took him hadn't left behind an answer, just a boundary, a place the dogs refused to cross. After the search was called off, the Harland family stayed in the cabin for 3 more days. They didn't speak much. Meals went uneaten. The children were kept inside, told not to play near the trees. Ellen sat in the same wooden chair by the front window, staring toward the ridge, waiting for something. Movement, a voice, the impossible. Her husband, Tom, paced. He made small efforts to keep routine, chopping wood, boiling water, shoveling the path, but there was a growing sense that whatever normalcy they clung to had fractured. On the final morning, Tom packed the car in silence. Ellen left a note on the dining table, just Robert's name and the date. Then they locked the door behind them. That winter, they didn't speak much about what had happened. When neighbors asked, Ellen would nod politely and say it was still being looked into. When Caleb, just 6 at the time, asked if Grandpa was lost or taken, Ellen would say softly, "He went into the woods, and sometimes the woods don't give people back." It wasn't an explanation, it was a wound. In the years that followed, the family rarely returned to the cabin. Once a place of quiet escapes and holiday traditions, it now felt hollow, like it held its breath. They went back only twice in the next 7 years, each time for less than a weekend. The first trip, in summer 2006, was meant to reclaim the space. Tom tried to fish. The kids roasted marshmallows. But Ellen spent most of it walking the woods, retracing old trails, looking for something, anything. She found nothing. The second trip was shorter. They left after one night when Ellen said she dreamed Robert was standing outside the window, staring at her through the glass but not moving. In 2011, after pressure from the state and the passage of 8 years, Robert Harland was declared legally deceased. The paperwork arrived in the mail, a typed certificate with a blank where the cause of death would have gone. It felt like an insult to all of them. Caleb, now 13, asked if that meant his body had been found. Ellen said no. It just meant they'd given up looking. That was the last time they spoke about it openly. But Caleb didn't forget. As he got older, the silence around his grandfather's disappearance turned into a fixation. He started reading wilderness survival manuals at 14, memorized topographic maps, watched every documentary he could find about disappearances in national parks, borderlands, and cold cases involving unexplainable terrain. At 16, he started hiking alone. By 18, he had built his own go bag, complete with fire starters, shelter gear, and a weatherproof notepad. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a ritual. He didn't talk about it much, but every trip he took was another attempt to understand what had happened to Robert. He revisited the ridge several times in college. Alone or with borrowed equipment, he kept detailed journals, drew maps, marked trees, always careful, always methodical, but never found more than frostbitten moss, fallen branches, and the same still silence that had swallowed his grandfather. Meanwhile, his mother changed in quieter ways. Ellen stopped celebrating holidays after 2011. She gave up decorating, attending church, and even reading. She began sleeping in the living room, afraid of the back hallway. Her world shrank to a small radius: work, grocery store, bedroom. She never sold the cabin, but she never mentioned it again. Not even when Caleb asked if he could take friends up there in the summers. She simply said, "That place isn't for anyone else." By the time Caleb turned 25, the property taxes were falling behind. Tom, now divorced from Ellen, reached out and suggested they let it go. Sell the land, donate the proceeds, move on. Caleb refused. Something in him believed the answer still lived there, not in ghosts or folklore, but in evidence. A trace was missed, a truth ignored. He started compiling a private archive, news clippings, SAR reports, obscure Reddit threads about vanishing hikers in Upper Michigan. He even reached out to retired officers who'd worked the search back in 2003. Most declined to talk. One agreed to a phone call and said quietly, "We weren't equipped for what that place did to people." Caleb never shared that quote with his mother. By 2020, the cabin had become something mythic in his mind. He hadn't been back in over a decade, but it lived inside him with sharp edges. He kept the keys on a separate ring, memorized the entry logs from the property line, checked Google Earth for changes, even though the satellite images were rarely updated. Still, he knew something was waiting. Not a person, maybe not even a clue, but something. The silence inside his family had festered into a pressure point. No one said it, but everyone still lived under the shadow of a single event they never understood. A man walked into the woods and vanished. No sign, no reason, no goodbye. Time kept moving, but that moment didn't. 20 years later, in the fall of 2023, Caleb made a decision. He put in for a week of leave, packed his survival gear, and told no one except his mother where he was going. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't ask questions. She only said, "If you hear anything, don't answer it." The next morning, Caleb drove north toward the ridge, toward the basin, toward the place the dogs had stopped. The cabin still stood, weathered but intact, and inside, buried in dust and silence, was something no one had ever found. Not until now. The first thing Caleb noticed when he stepped through the cabin door was the smell. Dust, dry wood, and something fainter, rot maybe, or old dampness trapped in the walls. The place hadn't been touched in over a decade, but the structure held. The furniture was as he remembered. The worn brown armchair in the corner, the old brass lamp. His grandfather's hat still hung on the peg by the door, stiff with age. It felt frozen, like the world had stopped the moment Robert walked out and never restarted. He moved slowly through the space, setting his gear down by the fireplace. It was late afternoon. Light filtered in through the grimy windows. Outside, the trees were the same. The ridge was the same. But inside, something felt different, subtle, just off-center. He moved to the hearth, crouched to sweep away ash, and noticed it. A warped edge in the wooden floor just left of the stonework. The board there was slightly raised, as if the moisture beneath had finally forced it upward. He ran his hand over it. It flexed. Not loose exactly, but not secure. He stood, went to his pack, and pulled out a folding knife. The wood resisted at first, creaking under the pressure, then lifted with a soft crack. Dust swirled up. Beneath the board, tucked between the joists, was a tightly wrapped bundle. Plastic sheeting, aged and brittle, wrapped several times and sealed with electrical tape. The edges were black with mold. Caleb's stomach tightened. He pulled it free and brought it to the table, laying it flat and carefully cutting the tape. Inside was a notebook, thick, water-warped, pages curled at the edges, but legible. And on the first page, in faded ink, was the date, November 3rd, 2003, the day after Robert vanished. Caleb didn't move for a long moment. His hands trembled. He scanned the page. The handwriting was slow, measured, but unmistakable. Blocky uppercase letters, the same style Robert had used on labeled toolboxes, shopping lists, and old letters. The ink had run in some places, but not all. He read the first, full line twice before fully processing it. "I am injured. No radio. Can't climb back up. Stuck in cavity or shaft. Not sure how far." He sat back, exhaling. Every part of his training, his obsession, kicked in. This was real. Not a reproduction, not a hoax. His grandfather had written this after he disappeared, which meant he'd survived the first day. Maybe more. Caleb flipped the page. The entry continued, a full paragraph of terse observations. Robert described a cold, narrow space, underground. He mentioned hitting his leg badly in a fall. He'd tried to signal with a whistle, but heard only strange echoes. Like yelling into a metal drum, he wrote. Sound bounces back wrong, feels too far down, no birds. Each page layered more detail. He'd marked time by scratching lines into the stone around him. There were long gaps between entries. Some were lucid, others read like fever dreams. One page simply repeated the phrase, "should not have gone in," 5 times. Caleb kept reading. He felt time was slow. It was past sunset now. The cabin was growing dark, but he didn't stop to turn on the light. He was reading the last words of a man who had vanished without explanation. And here they were, unspoken for 20 years. About halfway through the notebook, Robert started describing the place in more detail. He called it the shaft, and then later, the room. He believed he had found a vertical tunnel hidden under a pile of old stones near the ridge. He thought it might have been a ventilation shaft from a mining attempt long abandoned, though there was no known mining activity in that part of the forest. He wrote that the entrance had been obscured, and that he'd only noticed it because of a faint draft and a strange smell, sulfur, maybe, or rotting metal. He described falling in. A drop, but not straight-angled, slick with moss or mud. He didn't remember hitting the bottom, just waking up in the dark, with a searing pain in his leg and his pack missing. What followed were attempts to climb, signal, and map the space. He scratched notes on the walls. He left markings with a piece of charcoal he found in his pocket. Nothing worked. No one came. In one entry, he wrote, "Heard something above. Not sure if wind or voice. Doesn't respond. Don't trust it." In another, "I lit a fire from dry brush. The smoke didn't rise. It sat in the air and turned sideways, like there's no up." Caleb's pulse raced. The entries grew shorter after that. Some were scratched so lightly they barely registered. One simply said, "Still here." Near the back of the notebook, pages were stuck together, warped by moisture. Caleb carefully separated them. The last readable entry was dated November 11th, 8 days after Robert disappeared. The writing was shaky but coherent. It said, "If someone finds this, leave the hole sealed. It doesn't want out. It wants trade." Caleb stared at the sentence until the words lost shape. Then he stood, looked down at the floorboard and back at the notebook. This had been hidden, deliberately. Not buried in the woods, not left outside. Hidden in the heart of the cabin. Beneath the room they'd sat in for years, beneath the place where Robert had last been seen. He turned on the lamp beside the old armchair and sat with the notebook in his lap. The pages felt heavier than paper. The room felt colder than it had before. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a single question repeated. Why didn't anyone ever find this before now? Caleb didn't sleep. He tried, laying back on the old couch under a musty quilt, flashlight still clutched in his hand. But his mind wouldn't release the grip of what he'd just read. Instead, he sat up again and read the notebook cover to cover a second time. There was something different about reading it under a flashlight, alone in the dark, with the wind pressing against the windows and the wood creaking under its own weight. The words took on a sharper edge. The earliest entries were panicked, but rational. Robert described falling, unsure how far, unsure how fast. He'd landed on a sloped ledge in what he believed was a crevasse or sinkhole. He'd called out for help for hours, but only the echoes answered. His flashlight had died early. His radio was either lost in the fall or had no signal. The air was cold and thin. He rationed matches and made a small fire with pine needles from his coat pocket. It didn't burn long. Then the entries shifted. He started describing the acoustics of the space, how echoes came back wrong, delayed, stretched, or answering with extra syllables. At one point he wrote, I said, "Hello." It came back as, "Hello, hello, help." He wrote it twice, once in his normal script, then again, larger and underlined. A few pages later, He described what he called the drips, a constant sound of slow water, even though he saw none. He began to track time by them. Every 2 drips is a second, but every 100th sounds like glass. Then, I think I'm measuring wrong. Could be hours. Could be a trick. He scratched that out, wrote it again, then circled it. The writing got worse as the pages went on, tighter and erratic, like he was writing faster or in the dark. What shook Caleb most wasn't the descent into confusion. It was the return to clarity, suddenly and without warning, 10 pages later. I am not dead yet. But something else is. I heard my own voice calling for help today. It wasn't me that was followed by a list of names, some familiar, some not. Caleb recognized his mother's name, his own. Then a neighbor, then more names he didn't know. Some were scratched out. Others were written again with different spellings. Next to his own name, Robert had written, "Don't answer him." Don't trust the voice. Caleb read that line 3 times. His hands were sweating despite the cold. He turned the page. If someone finds this and I'm still down here, do not try to get me out. You'll end up like them. He underlined it twice. No context, no explanation, just a warning in the middle of a dying man's notes buried under the floorboards for 2 decades. By dawn, Caleb's thoughts were racing. He tried to rationalize it. Robert was injured, disoriented, maybe hallucinating. But the tone wasn't panicked anymore. It was calm, resigned, like a man who'd realized he wasn't lost in the usual way. He stared at the wood stove, long cold, and thought about all the time that had passed. This notebook had sat there for years, forgotten, undisturbed, and now it was in his hands. At 6:43 a.m., with the sun not quite up, Caleb stepped out onto the porch and made the call. His mother answered on the 3rd ring. She didn't speak at first, just listened as he told her what he found. When he said the words journal and Grandpa wrote in it after, she whispered, "Don't read it out loud." Not all of it. He asked why. She didn't answer. He told her he'd be bringing it home. Then, without thinking too hard about it, he called the sheriff's office in town, the same office that had filed the original report. He asked if anyone was still there from the 2003 case. The dispatcher was confused at first, but when he mentioned Robert Harland, there was a pause. The voice on the other end said, "You found something?" He said yes. An officer met him at the cabin an hour later. Caleb handed over the notebook, but not before taking photos of every page. The officer said they'd have to send it to forensics, maybe handwriting analysis. Caleb nodded. He wasn't sure what they could prove. He didn't care about proving it anymore. He just wanted someone else to see it, to understand that Robert hadn't vanished. He'd survived. He'd tried to warn them. As the officer drove off, notebook sealed in a bag, Caleb stood alone by the ridge. The air was colder now, still. No wind, no birds. He looked down at the slope where the dogs had once stopped and felt something heavy shift in his chest. He had answers now, but they weren't comforting. They weren't clean. They were just the beginning. The notebook didn't go straight to evidence storage. After the initial officer filed the report, it was hand-carried to the small regional sheriff's office in Ironwood, then locked in a drawer until they could confirm its authenticity. Within 2 days, it was sent downstairs to a forensics lab in Lansing, where analysts began testing the ink, paper, and DNA traces. The initial results were clear enough. The notebook was real. The ink predated modern formulations. The saliva trace on one of the page corners matched Robert Harland's DNA from an old family toothbrush submitted years ago for his missing persons file. But the contents raised more questions than they answered. In the center of the notebook, pressed between 2 incoherent entries about voices and shadows, was a crudely drawn map. It was done in pencil, jagged lines crossing over each other, arrows pointing in multiple directions. Some areas were labeled in block print: stone door, chimney vent, antenna, and ridge drop. Others were marked only with symbols: a triangle, a spiral, a set of hash marks. What stood out to investigators were the landmarks: a cracked birch tree, a sulfur smell, A cluster of rocks in the shape of a CA rusted-out piece of metal, possibly an old antenna, leaning against a dead spruce. Robert noted the direction of the wind, described the slope of the ground, and even sketched the position of shadows at noon. It was all so specific, but when the SAR team from the original 2003 search pulled out their old GPS files and compared them to a topographic overlay of the terrain, nothing lined up. There were no birch trees cracked in that pattern, no chimney vent, no rock cluster that matched the shape he'd drawn. The forest near the ridge had remained largely unchanged in 2 decades, yet the geography in the notebook seemed misaligned, as if Robert had been describing a place adjacent to reality. One SAR technician described it as almost accurate, but off by degrees, as if he was seeing the land through mirrored glass. At first, they assumed disorientation. A head injury could have caused spatial confusion. Robert may have thought he was near landmarks that didn't exist, but the way he wrote about them, repeatedly and in exacting detail, unsettled several of the readers. In one note next to the stone doorway, Robert had written, "It breathes on cold mornings. Only then. Sulfur. The wind doesn't touch it." He'd circled that phrase. Caleb, meanwhile, wasn't interested in theories. He knew his grandfather. The man didn't embellish. If he wrote it, he saw it. So Caleb pushed. He contacted the same officers who'd handled the notebook intake and requested a formal search of the area described in the map. They refused at first, budget limitations, lack of new evidence, weather conditions. But when Caleb provided the satellite photos he'd spent months collecting, the same forest area photographed over years, cross-referenced with seasonal foliage changes and irregular shadows, they paused. There were inconsistencies in a few frames, a long, straight shadow in a clearing where no known structure stood, an unusual disruption in the tree line near the ridge, appearing only in early morning captures. Eventually, under pressure and renewed interest, the sheriff's office agreed to reopen the case, informally. They didn't want media attention, no public statement, no press, just a quiet grid search, limited to 2 days, with SAR volunteers and 1 geological survey expert. Caleb was invited to join them. He spent the night before the search laying out his own maps on the cabin table, comparing his grandfather's notes to the topographic data. He marked off every possible area where the chimney vent could have been. He highlighted the tree line. He circled a small flat rise near the ridge's base, an area never searched closely in 2003 because the dogs had lost the trail earlier. The team assembled at sunrise the next day. It was late October. The forest was cold and quiet. They are divided into 4 groups, each equipped with GPS trackers and body cams. Caleb joined the group headed toward the base of the ridge, keeping the notebook pages in a sealed plastic sleeve inside his jacket. For 6 hours, they walked the perimeter. Nothing, no markers, no tree cracks, no sulfur smell. Then, around 2:15 p.m., Caleb stopped suddenly. There, just off the marked trail, half hidden behind a boulder, was a fallen piece of rusted metal, long, tubular, hollow at one end. It looked like the end of an antenna. He called one of the SAR leaders over. They confirmed it wasn't in the 2003 logs, and a few feet beyond it stood a birch tree, split clean down the middle, cracked. Caleb didn't say anything. He just pointed to the drawing. The team looked at each other, then radioed the rest. They'd found something. Not the stone doorway yet, not the shaft. But for the first time in 20 years, the map no longer looked imaginary. It looked like a key. And Caleb wasn't ready to stop turning it. They almost missed it. The stone ledge blended into the forest floor, barely more than a bump in the terrain, moss-covered, shaded by thick pine branches, tucked low against the slope near the eastern edge of the basin. Caleb and the volunteers had walked past it twice already that morning, not realizing what lay beneath. It wasn't until one of them slipped on the damp moss and fell sideways that the opening revealed itself. Just a slit at first. Then, as Caleb got down on his knees and began clearing the edge with gloved hands, the ground gave way to something deeper. A vertical shaft. roughly 3 feet wide with jagged sides and a steep drop that vanished into darkness. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It matched the description almost exactly: narrow, hidden beneath stone, covered in moss and pine debris, just like Robert had written. But this wasn't a trail marker. It wasn't a man-dug well. It looked natural at first, until they noticed the marks. Scratches lined the inner edges of the rock, some horizontal, some curved, not uniform, not clean, like something or someone had tried to grip the edges going in or coming out. Claw marks, tool marks, no one was sure, but they didn't look fresh. The stone had been worn smooth in places, almost polished by contact, and yet no search logs from 2003 made mention of it. Caleb checked twice. Nothing. The area around the ledge was strangely quiet. No birds, no wind, just a constant low hum from the trees swaying above, like the forest was holding something in. They cleared a perimeter and set up camp nearby. The sheriff's office had been notified, but again, no formal operation had been approved. It was just a private search. Off record. Quiet. Caleb had brought a trail cam with audio, basic motion detection, infrared sensor, audio up to 30 seconds after movement. He mounted it 6 feet from the shaft, angled downward, then stepped back and waited. For 6 days, it captured nothing. No deer, no raccoons, no sign of animal activity around the ledge at all, which was strange in itself. The surrounding forest was thick with wildlife, but the footage showed only wind through the grass, an occasional falling pine cone, a stray leaf blowing past the lens. Then, on the 7th night, everything changed. At 2:18 a.m., the audio was triggered by what the system flagged as movement, though nothing visible appeared on camera. The frame remained still, grainy and gray. But then came the sound. A cough. Faint. Humans. And not from the surrounding woods. It echoed from inside the shaft. It wasn't long, less than a second. A dry, single cough, like someone clearing their throat or trying to speak. Then silence. The sensor stayed active for another 30 seconds. Nothing more. Caleb reviewed the footage 3 times before showing the team. No one spoke for several minutes. The audio was too clear to dismiss, too specific, and coming from a place no human should be. The next morning, they flagged the shaft with orange tape and called it in. This time the sheriff came by himself. He was older now, retired once, then brought back part-time when staffing dried up. He'd been on the original search in 2003. He stood at the edge of the shaft and looked down for a long time. "You think he's in there?" he asked. Caleb didn't answer. A formal request was filed that afternoon for a camera descent, basic borehole drop cam with night vision. It would take a few days to arrive. In the meantime, the team tightened the perimeter. They set up a second trail cam at a wider angle. No one went near the shaft without a partner. The scratches on the stone walls had begun to bother them. The silence in the clearing had become oppressive. That night, Caleb sat near the fire, reading his grandfather's journal for the 12th time. One line kept echoing in his mind. "It breathes on cold mornings. Only then. Sulfur. The wind doesn't touch it." He hadn't noticed the smell earlier, but now, in the still air, something faint drifted in, like burnt matches or rusted metal just after rain. He got up and walked to the shaft, and as he stood there, just past midnight, something shifted in the trees behind him. Not a noise, not movement, just a feeling, like he was being watched from under the ground instead of above it. He turned back and stared into the darkness. There was no wind, no moonlight, only that smell, faint and strange, leaking up from the place his grandfather had once fallen into and never returned from. In less than 48 hours, they'd lower a camera inside. Caleb didn't know what they'd find, but for the first time in 20 years, the forest had finally answered. They waited 2 more days for the equipment to arrive, an industrial-grade drop camera with infrared night vision, a reinforced tether, and a remote rig designed for tight vertical shafts. It had been borrowed from a geological team downstairs, not standard police issue, but good enough for what they were trying to do. Caleb helped the team lower the tripod. It took over an hour to set up. The moss around the shaft had to be cleared further, and temporary anchoring installed to prevent a collapse. Everyone present knew the rock was unstable, but no one said it out loud. Just before noon, the camera was turned on and the descent began. At first, it showed only what they expected: layers of stone, roots clinging to the walls, a narrowing throat that dipped away from the surface light. About 15 feet down, the walls shifted from dirt-lined to smooth rock. Caleb leaned in closer to the monitor. The temperature on the sensor dropped rapidly. The further the camera dropped, the more the color fell from the image, until everything below was washed in pale green, lit only by the infrared beam. At 30 feet, the camera tilted slightly and caught something unexpected. A sleeve, faded olive green, frayed along the edge, resting against the wall as if a body were leaned there, seated or slumped. Caleb's heart kicked into his throat. The feed trembled as the cable strained against the camera's weight, but the image held long enough for one still frame. A folded sleeve with stitching along the cuff, military style. The kind Robert Harland had worn in every photo. One gloved hand off screen, not visible, no movement. Then something else came into frame. A face, only for a second, blurred by shadow and the camera's slight spin, but unmistakably human. Pale, eyes wide, mouth closed, still. Then the image is cut out, static. A flicker of signal, then black. The operator tried to re-engage the camera feed, pulling the tether slowly to recalibrate. The screen flashed once, briefly showing rock, then glitched again. The decision was made to pull the camera up. It came back damaged, the lens cracked, the casing scraped like it had been struck or dragged. No one knew what hit it. For the rest of the day, the site was quiet. The footage, what little of it was recorded, was saved and backed up. Only 4 people saw it before the feed was classified by the sheriff's office: the tech, the sheriff, 1 deputy, and Caleb. The rest heard only fragments. But fragments were enough. Rumors started immediately. Some said the face had blinked. Others swore the eyes moved, tracking the camera. Someone claimed they heard a whisper in the audio feed, though no one could isolate it. That night, the team met at the nearby ranger station and reviewed what little data they had. The footage showed a sleeve, possibly a person, possibly remains. The face was too distorted to confirm identity, but Caleb didn't hesitate. He said it aloud before anyone else had the nerve. That was him. The others didn't answer. The sleeve alone was convincing. Robert's jacket had been olive green military issue, passed down from his father. He wore it every year in that cabin. Ellen had described it to search teams in 2003. No other person had gone missing in that area since. Still, protocol required caution. The shaft was shallow but unstable. Any descent would risk collapse, and there were other concerns. Gases, methane, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds could pool in pockets underground. Exposure could trigger hallucinations, unconsciousness, even death. The sheriff insisted on bringing in specialists before attempting recovery. A call was made to a mining safety consultant. The earliest they could arrive was in 3 days. In the meantime, the site was cordoned off. Caleb stayed nearby, sleeping in his car outside the station, unwilling to leave. The following morning brought heavy rain. The temperature dropped, and fog rolled through the basin, turning the forest into a blurred maze of wet pine and gray rock. No one approached the shaft. The ground around it had softened. Landslide risk increased. Caleb argued for a quicker descent before the weather closed in further, but was denied. Privately, he kept reviewing the footage frame by frame, the sleeve, the shape of the collar, the faded patch near the shoulder, all matching. But it was the face that haunted him. Not because it was damaged or decomposed, not because it was unexpected, but because, for just a split second, he could have sworn it was looking past the camera, not into it, past it, toward something else in the dark. He didn't tell the others. He just sat by the trailhead in the rain, listening to the trees creak in the wind, wondering how a man could fall 30 feet and never be found, until now. Wondering what had kept him hidden, wondering if it was still down there, sitting in the dark beside him, waiting. The team would descend once the weather cleared, but some questions were already circling like vultures. What if that wasn't just a body? What if it hadn't been dead all these years? And what if Robert had never been alone down there? The journal had already been scanned, cataloged, and entered into evidence, but a few lines kept bothering the team, not because of what they said, but how they were written. One of the analysts noticed it first during a routine review of the final entries. The letters didn't quite match the rest. The strokes were tighter, the curves sharper. The spacing between words, smaller, more compressed. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once noticed, it couldn't be unseen. A forensic linguist from Grand Rapids was brought in, along with a handwriting analyst who had worked cold cases for over 2 decades. They were given only the photocopies at first, instructed to analyze without context. Within 48 hours, they returned their findings. The results were clear. The last 4 pages were not written by Robert Harland, or at least not by the same version of him who had written the rest. The shift was jarring when examined closely. Up until page 43, Robert's entries were consistent, structured sentences, block print, predictable grammar. Even as his mental state deteriorated, the syntax remained intact: subject, verb, object, short bursts, military precision. Then, beginning with page 44, everything changed. The lettering slanted slightly. Punctuation vanished. The language grew more archaic. Sentences blurred into one another, lacking cohesion. The tone changed too. The earlier entries were desperate but grounded, mentions of cold, pain, fear. These final pages felt foreign, detached. One page simply read, "He said it would echo forever if I listened long enough. I heard my own name backwards. That's how he knows it's time." Another, "No more days, just open, just the open that listens." And the last page, dated November 12th, 11 days after Robert disappeared, held only a single line. "He is mine now. This is the price of listening." No signature, no date stamp, just that. The handwriting expert noted that the slant of the letters was more consistent with a different dominant hand, possibly left instead of right. The pressure points on the paper showed deeper indentations, indicating a heavier hand, more forceful, less restrained. And the spacing between lines had shrunk by nearly half. It wasn't just that the words were strange. It was that they didn't sound like him anymore. The sheriff's department was cautious in how they handled the findings. They couldn't explain why the entries had changed. They couldn't rule out the possibility that Robert, disoriented, hypothermic, possibly injured, had written them himself in a deteriorated state. But it didn't line up with the dates. According to forensic estimation, his most likely time of death was between November 6th and 8th. These final pages were dated after, which meant either the dates were wrong or someone else had written them. The possibility that someone had found Robert alive and left him was difficult to process. That would suggest a level of negligence, maybe even intent. But who? And why hide it for 20 years? No one else was missing in the area. No evidence of another person at the shaft, unless the second writer wasn't a person at all. That theory wasn't formalized. No one dared use words like other or entity. But Caleb saw it in their eyes, the hesitation, the quiet tension in every room where the journal was discussed. They didn't know what they were dealing with, and worse, they couldn't rule anything out. Caleb took the findings personally. To him, it wasn't a paid ED mystery. It was confirmation. His grandfather had survived that fall, had written through the pain, through the fear, through the isolation. And then something had taken over. Not death, not madness, something else. He brought the notebook pages back to the shaft and read them aloud. Not the last ones, just the earlier ones. The warnings, the locations, the lines about echoes and vents and doors that breathed. Then he stood there, staring into the black, feeling the air shift against his skin. He wanted to go down. He asked the sheriff for clearance, formally. The request was denied. Too dangerous, shaft unstable, risk of collapse, toxic gas exposure, legal liability. The sheriff's tone was firm, but not unkind. He'd seen the same footage. He knew the dangers. But more than that, he believed Caleb wasn't asking to go down there to gather evidence. He was asking to face something, and maybe not come back up. Caleb protested. He argued. He cited his training, his experience, his right to closure. The sheriff didn't budge. "The thing down there," he said quietly, "if it took your grandfather, it'll take you too." No one said that part on the record, but it was understood. In the days that followed, the investigation stalled again. The weather worsened. Permits for excavation were delayed. The shaft remained sealed, flagged with hazard signs and cordoned off with yellow tape. The forest around it fell silent once more. But Caleb didn't leave. He camped nearby, staring into the woods at night, listening, waiting. And in his pocket, folded and creased, he kept the copy of that final line. "He is mine now. This is the price of listening." The notebook hadn't just documented a death. It had warned them about what would happen next. The descent happened just after sunrise, under a gray sky that threatened early snow. A full recovery team was assembled: state police, search and rescue veterans, geological safety consultants, and a forensic pathologist. The shaft had been reinforced with aluminum bracing overnight, and oxygen sensors were lowered first to check for toxic gases. Readings came back low but stable. It was safe enough. The team began the slow drop with harnesses and headlamps, every movement logged, every step recorded. Caleb stood above the rim, silent, watching. 32 feet down, the rock walls curved inward, forming a shallow cavity just large enough for a crouching adult. A thin shelf of stone jutted out, flattened over time by erosion or use. At 34 feet, the lead tech called out, "We see him!" The body sat at the far end of the space, tucked beneath the rock curve as if seated by choice. Not collapsed, not fallen. Legs bent, back upright, arms resting gently over the knees, hands folded. The posture was eerie, unnatural in its calm. Like someone posing for a photograph, the clothing was intact. A heavy olive green jacket, dark canvas pants, worn boots. No signs of shredding or insect. Damage. No chewing, no claw marks, no indication that animals had ever come near. The forensic pathologist took photographs before the body was touched. The face had dried and sunken in the way mummification often preserved in cold, low-moisture environments. Skin like paper, eyes closed, lips parted slightly. No expression of pain, no visible trauma. It looked like Robert Harland had sat down, leaned back, and waited. Once the body was raised, the official documentation began. Autopsy later confirmed what they had suspected: death by exposure and dehydration. There were signs of a leg fracture, likely from the fall, which had prevented escape. No internal bleeding, no blunt force trauma. He hadn't died violently. He'd died waiting, quietly, alone. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part came after. The team transported the body to the county coroner's office, where the journal, still under forensic review, was waiting. During the secondary analysis of the journal's binding, dried residue was discovered along the inner spine. Blood. It had soaked into the central thread and hardened. DNA testing confirmed the blood matched Robert Harland. That, in itself, wasn't shocking. But what followed was. Carbon dating of the final entries ink, the last 4 pages, was conducted as part of the forensic timeline analysis. The results were cross-checked twice. The ink on the last page, dated November 12th, was laid down between November 13th and 15th, 2 full days after Robert was already estimated to have died. The margin of error was small, less than 48 hours. But the implications were massive. Robert's body had been lifeless for days, likely deceased by November 8th, based on temperature exposure modeling and tissue dehydration estimates. And yet, the ink, the pressure of the handwriting, the smudges from fingers dragging across the wet page, was newer, fresh, made after death. There was no evidence of another person in that shaft, no second body, no tools, no signs of intrusion, just a man who died sitting up, and a notebook that kept being written in. The forensic linguist was called again. He reviewed the data, examined the pressure depth of the final line. "He is mine now." This is the price of listening. He confirmed it wasn't an imprint from a hand dragged across a page. It was written with conscious force. Ink flow matched a standard pen under normal pressure. Someone, something, had written it, after Robert was already gone. That detail never made it into the public report. The body was quietly returned to the Harland family. The sheriff released an official statement. Robert Harland, 68, died of misadventure during a solo walk in the woods in 2003. His remains had now been recovered. Closure was possible. Case closed. But inside the family, no one believed it was that simple. The shaft was sealed with stone and concrete 2 days later. No plaque, no marker, just backfilled. Rock and a flag in the GPS log. Do not re-enter. 2023 recovery site. Even the recovery team didn't ask questions. No one wanted to return. Caleb kept the photocopies of the journal, all of them. He read them every night for weeks after the funeral. Sometimes he'd wake up and swear he heard a voice repeating a line, one of the ones Robert never finished. Other times, it was just the sound of a cough, faint and distant with no source. In an interview with a regional news outlet, Caleb said only one sentence before declining further comment. Grandpa never came back. Something else did, and it left a warning. What that warning meant, no one could say for certain, but for those who had read the final page, the one dated after Robert's death, the silence of the woods felt heavier now, like something had been disturbed, like something had been waiting, and perhaps still was.